it comes to the prospect of owning a big American 4x4, SUV, pickup, whatever the case may be, well, not only is it something which many people love the idea of in the UK, and you definitely see more of them over the past few years, to the point where I think you could probably open a Cadillac Escalade import business and only sell those and you'd do really well, but also some people are potentially put off by a number of factors. Things like, what's the reliability like? Can you get parts? Surely the fuel is horrendous. What's the left-hand drive like? And of course the kicker, is it too big for UK roads? Well, I'm going to put time codes in the description and on the timeline of the video below so you can skip to different questions. We're going to touch on 5. In my opinion, the most important 5 things that you need to know if you are serious about owning a Cadillac Escalade in any form. Mine, which, spoiler alert, this is not only a review, but it's my official announcement of my latest purchase, because this is in fact my new daily driver, a 2011 Escalade ESV, which is the Escalade stretch vehicle, aka long wheelbase, so it still has 7 seats, just like the shorter version, but even more of a boot on the back. Personally, I think the looks really suit it being even longer, but we're going to get into that first. Is it too big for UK roads? Well, the simple answer is no. For those who haven't noticed, we have something called Eddie Stobart lorries flying around our roads, and whatever other brand of that same size vehicle, so anyone who says that these are too big are essentially saying more about their own lack of driving skill than they are about whether or not it can fit on a physical road. Because as somebody whose past 4 American vehicles were all left-hand drive, and the only difference to this one was that all 3 of those were over 50 years old, I can categorically tell you, not only can they fit, but they were literally my daily drivers, all 10 to the gallon of them. But this one is a definite improvement when it comes to that, and of course we're going to talk specs as well, so I will be talking about fuel economy. For now though, we're purely talking about what it's like to drive. Left-hand drive will be by far the biggest thing that puts some people off. For me, as I said, I've owned left-hand drive exclusively for a while now, and honestly, I prefer it for 2 primary reasons. One, it's convenient. You can just park next to the curb and get straight out, which is something that you don't even think of now, but it's actually nice to have. More importantly though, and this one really comes in handy, especially in a huge vehicle like this, or in my Lincoln, if you're overtaking parked cars, you can get so ridiculously close to those cars because you know exactly where you are. Whereas if you'll notice everyone around you, they're so far away from the vehicles to avoid hitting them, you end up being in the middle of the road or even in oncoming traffic. I can legitimately stay in the left lane with parked cars in the lane and not be in anyone's way. Even in something as big as this, all 79 inches wide, 224 inches long of it. Which, as ironic as it sounds, is actually still smaller than the car I part exchanged for it. My 1960 Lincoln Premier is another 3 inches longer and another inch wider. I was using that as my daily, so anyone who says these can't fit on UK roads is simply wrong. Can left-hand drive take some getting used to? Well, obviously, it's something new for most people. For me, it took about 15 minutes to get used to it, and even then, it was not something that was difficult, it was just reminding your brain to stick a little bit more to the left. Once you get used to it, you don't even give it a second thought. I certainly don't. And for me, I don't even find it difficult to go back and forth between right and left-hand drive, but each to their own. The next question is though, and this is one part of 2, if you will. First of all, how does it compare to European 4x4s, or SUVs as our American friends call them? And then, after that, how does it compare to other American ones? Now, first of all, of course, the most important question specifically here in the UK or anywhere in Europe is, should you get one of these over the most obvious choice of a Range Rover here in the UK? This, in my opinion, is America's Range Rover, or an Audi Q7, Mercedes ML, GL, BMW X5, etc, etc, etc. Well, there's one fundamental difference. In fact, there are 2. There's one fundamental difference in terms of how they're made, the approach that the manufacturer takes, and the second fundamental difference is in terms of engineering. So first things first, the reason why these American SUVs, Navigator, Escalade, even trucks like the Ram, etc., feel and look and are so different to the European ones is actually as simple as what they're designed to feel like. Imagine an Audi Q7 or to some degree a Range Rover, but not quite as much. They're designed to feel like essentially big cars. Sounds like an obvious statement, but these aren't. In fact, Americans don't even like it when you call these cars. They would call it a truck or an SUV, never a car, even though I prefer using car as just the general statement. Here in the UK, and in the rest of Europe, stuff like the Q7 from Audi is designed to feel like an Audi that's just taller, longer and bigger, to have as close to the same kind of dynamics and interior design and even styling that a normal car would have. It's just bigger in every way. That is not how America does it. American vehicles like this one take more of a luxury truck approach, which is a big tank-like chassis, muscle car approach to its engine, all utility all the time, and then, for the sake of something like a luxury version, like a Navigator or an Escalade, you add a better interior, add on the back end for the closed luggage room and extra seats, etc., and you're pretty much good to go. It's why things like this look so similar to your Dodge Rams, your Silverados. Now that was one thing which I was actually expecting, and that brings us to the next question as well in a second, but how it compares to something like a Dodge Ram. We'll get to that in a minute though. For now, the fundamental difference in practice of driving it is that, sure, a Euro 1 will be a bit more dynamic through corners. That's not to say that this is wallowy. This vehicle doesn't sway around or float over the road any more than a Range Rover does. Literally, I've driven a Range Rover, I love the SVR here on the channel, but they are very different approaches to the same fundamental idea. This feels like utility first, performance second. And let's be honest, if you're going to buy something like this, that's probably what you're looking for, considering that no Escalade of this generation was built for performance anyway. There was no Escalade V until, well, now, with the latest one. In terms of utility, in my opinion, there is no competition whatsoever from Europe. Because consider this, the Range Rover, for all of its size, it's got 5 seats. You're not getting any more seats than a Mini or a Golf or any other hatchback. In this one, not only do you get 7 seats in the case of mine, which is kind of weirdly a 2-2-3 arrangement, but also you can completely remove the back ones, have even more space, and even with all 7 seats up, as you can see in the video, I still have about the same amount of luggage space, if not more so, than something like a Touareg, a Cayenne, or even a Range Rover. From a utility perspective, they are categorically more practical. That's all there is to it. Now, off-road is another question, but let's be honest, how often are you really going to take this off-road? Even if you had a Hummer, how often are you going to take that off-road? I'm sure some people will, but most probably won't. And you certainly won't be in most Range Rovers either, certainly not if it's something like an autobiography. To jump into the question of comparing it to other American ones though, the reason why I want to touch on that is because that is what, honestly, I was expecting. Because before agreeing to part exchange, or it was actually a straight swap, my Lincoln for this one, I fully expected this to feel basically the same as the Dodge Rams did. More so probably the 2016 Dodge Ram Hemi Quad Cab, which I recently reviewed on the channel. I thought it would be kind of like that, but with maybe a bit better stability over the back because of the slight extra weight. It's actually nothing like a Dodge Ram, and that's nice to know, because you do want it to feel different, and it genuinely does. In fact, it feels more nimble, it has more personality, more character, it's definitely sharper through corners than a Ram, even in Hemi, or including SRT10 form, which I also reviewed, and if this takes corners better than a Viper-engined Ram, then, I mean, that says all you need to know, really. But honestly, the handling is lovely to work with. And of course, with its height, you will notice bumps in the road in the same way as you would on a double-decker bus, but it's not uncomfortable to drive, it has air suspension as standard, and we're going to come back to stuff like air suspension in a second, because of course that touches on things like reliability and parts. So in short, if you are thinking about getting something like this, or a Hummer, or a Ram, or an F-150, etc, etc, I would strongly say, and I know not everyone has this chance, but definitely drive multiple before you make your mind up. Driving the Rams made me more open to having a vehicle like this, but at the same time it's not really that much like it. So it gives you more of an idea of what to expect, but it's still not quite the same by any stretch. I will say this is similar enough to something like a Range Rover, even something as comparatively new as an SVR, but at the same time it does have its own character. It definitely feels, like I said earlier on, utility first and everything else second. So it doesn't quite have as much pizzazz to its interior design, for example, as a Range Rover does. I'll be the first to admit that. But again, America's not exactly known for having great interior design. Sure, there's leather everywhere and it has most of the kit that you'd want. In fact, some of the heads-up stuff is pretty cool. You can check on the transmission temperature and even the remaining life of the oil in terms of a percentage. So it has pretty much everything you realistically want. Of course, it has the fairly outdated but still technically there sat nav, etc. Mine has a Japanese unit which I need to swap out, potentially to one of those touchscreen Tesla style units. Of course it has the rear screen that comes down, fitted as standard, the Alpine system, lovely sound system as well. You have the rear infotainment as well for other passengers, I believe even more so in the top of the line Platinums, and there are a few different trims to choose from. Of course you've got the EXT, which is the truck. It's a cool truck, but it falls into a similar pitfall as the Mercedes X-Class in my opinion, which is who's really asking for that. A luxury truck is a bit too niche, I think. But then you've got the standard wheelbase, which is great. You've got the ESV, as I have here, which is essentially everything good about the normal one, but even more room, even more space, and even more imposing to look at. And of course, aside from that, you've got different trim levels, the Platinum being the top of the tree. Now let's get to the juicy stuff. What's it like living with it? What are the specs? What's the performance, etc.? But more so, what's the fuel economy? What's the parts? What's sourcing it like? What's servicing something like this like? Is it, crucially, more or less reliable than the European counterparts? And we're going to actually loop around to something I mentioned earlier on as well, in terms of the difference between how Americans build an SUV or a truck compared to how Europeans do, especially Germans. First things first, fuel. It's an obvious question to ask. I've been averaging about 17, 18 to the gallon. So maybe not as good as some might expect, but I guarantee a hell of a lot better than some would be expecting. And part of the reason why is because it has cylinder deactivation. In practice, that means that this one shuts off, I believe it's the front half of the engine and uses more so the rear. It's a 6.2 litre V8. And the curious thing to me about the engine is it shares a lot in common with a Corvette. And of course both are GM products, but for some reason they didn't just put a Corvette engine in there. Maybe it's because of the deactivation, I'm not exactly sure, but it's got almost the same specs. 6.2 V8, naturally aspirated, just over 400 horsepower and 420 foot-pounds of torque, which for a naturally aspirated engine is more than enough. Of course, being a GM product, you could get some Hennessy parts on there pretty easily, or other stuff as well, and you can put huge power out of these engines if performance is your thing. At the same time though, the cylinder deactivation means you're essentially driving as a 3.1 litre V4 if you drive it calm like I do, which drastically improves the economy compared to what you'd expect. For something with that size engine that weighs not far off 3 tons, 2.7 metric tons, 6,000 pounds for our American friends, with a towing capacity of just under 8,000 pounds, which is 3.5 tons of towing weight here in the UK, you'd expect it to be horrendous on fuel. But you don't have to just take my word for it. There is another channel, I forget the name, but it's that German POV driving channel where he takes cars on the Autobahn. He took one of these on there, and at 105 miles an hour, which is the limiter, it's still doing 8 to the gallon. Which is insane, because that's not much different to what I'm getting at 50 miles an hour out of my Lincoln. Of course, from 60 years ago, but still. So it proves that the economy is a hell of a lot better than you'd think, and despite being so close to something like a Hummer H2, this definitely feels, looks, and is a more polished approach. With better fuel economy, I believe probably at least in part due to the lower weight, but in particular the better aerodynamics, it really does make a difference. In terms of parts, reliability, and servicing, well, of course, that's the juicy stuff. Now, at the time of making this video, there is only one Cadillac-approved servicing location, if you will, in the entirety of the UK. I don't recall exactly what they're called or where they're based, but I believe it's somewhere around the mid-south region of England, so a couple of hours drive from me. I certainly wouldn't go to them to fit everything, and I definitely wouldn't get them to source parts for me, because you know the V8 is going to be a killer. But in terms of servicing, my particular car only has 45,000 miles on the clock, so very low as a Japanese import. I'm planning to get it serviced at 50,000 and then probably every 10 after that, depending on how long I have it for. And you know me, I don't tend to have cars for that long, but I could see myself having this one for longer because I love it. It's a brilliant machine. Getting parts is not difficult at all. And that's really all there is to it. Even in the UK, there's a company called Rock Auto, for example. I use them mostly for my classics, but they still have Escalade parts for stuff like this. And last I checked, you can buy stuff even like the air suspension dampers for a fraction of the cost of what that equivalent thing would cost on something like a Range Rover. And that brings me back to what I said about how Euro SUVs are built different. Sure, they are more efficient. Sure, they are more tech heavy, but that can bite you in the ass, because when they go wrong, the Audi Q7, and any owner of one will attest to this, are very, very expensive. With the American stuff, it's not even close. It's literally a fraction. So ironically, The approach that Cadillac is taking here, or more so I guess GM really, is actually one of the reasons why I love Jaguars so much here in the UK. A, they're simpler in the first place, having more of a modern day muscle car approach, but also not only does that make them simpler and more reliable, it means that the things that do break are cheaper anyway. So for those who say, yeah, but is a Cadillac really that reliable? Well, that by definition means that those people are presuming, with the very question, that something like a Range Rover is more reliable, when you know as well as I do, Range Rovers are far from cheap to fix, and they are known, especially in certain generations, such as for example the more recent SVR kind of shape, to have subpar build quality in some cases. American stuff is simpler, their interiors are not as pizzazz, not as flash compared to Euro stuff, but they're big old muscle cars in an SUV body, and that pays dividends when it comes to buying parts and its simplicity. In terms of servicing, I pretty much already touched on what I said. You wouldn't have to go to the place that I'm going to probably take it to. I know it will cost more, but the main reason why I'm doing that is just to keep up the resale value, as I am its first UK owner, and with such low mileage, I want to give the car the best chance it can have of keeping that value. Even if you go somewhere else, there are plenty of specialists here in the UK, and the thing is, nothing about this car is that complex. In fact, it's simpler than something like a Range Rover, so any competent, self-serious mechanic or garage will be able to service it. I'm still going to take it to the actual specialists, but you don't have to. And although for most potential buyers you probably won't care too much about this, if you are curious about how quick these things actually are, I already mentioned of course 2.7 tons, 400 horsepower, 420 torque and a top speed of about 105 if you keep the limiter on. They can do a lot higher without it, more like 130, 140 I believe. What about acceleration? Well, actually, pretty damn good on that too. Now, four-wheel drive was an option on these, or all-wheel drive I should say, because one of the things which I wish you could do, and at least you can't on mine, is I wish that like the Dodge Ram, you could press 3 different buttons to switch between 4 rear and four-wheel drive low, because that would come in handy. These apparently have an automatic system where it kicks in when needed, so more like a Golf R32's kind of approach, all-wheel drive rather than four-wheel drive, and some of these are rear-wheel drive if they don't have the four-wheel drive optional extra. So that's something to bear in mind. The sheer weight and size of the vehicle though makes it feel like it has four-wheel drive anyway because it's so grounded. In terms of performance though, to jump back to what I said about 0 to 60, well officially it's about 6.9 seconds, so again about as quick as my V10 Touareg was, not bad at all. But in practice, I've actually seen people on YouTube launching these things, if you give it a little bit of the beans beforehand, in more like 6 seconds dead. That's not bad at all, and because it's a petrol rather than a diesel, as many European equivalents would be, it means that you still get that fantastic proper V8 soundtrack as well. So, that moves us to, of course, the final question. What's the verdict? Is it worth buying an Escalade over a Range Rover, over other European ones like Beamers, Mercs, Audis, etc., but also is it worth buying one instead of something like a Hummer, a Ram, an F-150, maybe its nearest natural rival, of course, the Lincoln Navigator? Well, first of all, to speak subjectively, yes, I did. So clearly, I believe that it's a good option because I did get one of these. It's been on my bucket list for quite some time, and so far at least, I do not regret it at all. Plus, as a top tip to those who are looking to get better road tax here in the UK, I would strongly recommend trying to get yourself a Japanese import. Just like I did with my Golf R32, it means that your yearly road tax is less than half. So instead of around, £720 or whatever for a Range Rover, I paid $325 to tax this thing, which is kind of insane, given that it's that 6.2 monster V8. At the same time, Japanese people don't salt the roads, from what I understand, and Japanese petrol heads in particular take really good care of their cars. I cannot say that enough. So if you are looking for an import, I would actually say look to Japan where possible, rather than even America. They are very versatile machines, and not only are you literally looking down on Range Rovers in these things, even with standard ride height, but they feel every bit as special as you would want them to when you're actually getting to use it as a daily. You jump in a Range Rover, it's a nice place to be. You jump in this, it's just badass. There's no two ways of saying it. Jumping in a Ram or Silverado or an F-150 is great, but those are even more utility first. You can get luxury ones, of course, but it's still a truck at the end of the day, and that's its main purpose. With an SUV like this one or a Navigator, it's the luxury first. The pilot seats behind you kind of make that obvious. I wanted to bring my perspective as a UK fan and, more importantly, a UK owner, so if you do want to see more Escalade content, doubtless I will feature it more on the channel, and of course in the long run, I would, depending on how long I have it for in the end, love to do a long-term review, as I have in the past as well. For me, it's a very easy recommendation. It might be a cliche to say, yeah, I bought one, I love it. But at the end of the day, like Clarkson buying certain cars that he loves, you can talk about cars all day long, but you really vote with your wallet. So any reviewer who actually goes out and buys a particular machine with their reasons for doing so, as I have here, to me that speaks far more than just another review. So that's it for my thoughts on the Escalade ESV in particular of this third generation shape. And of course, if you used to be an owner, if you've got one now, or if you're thinking of getting one, tell me down below. And crucially, check the comments down below if you are thinking of getting one, because I like to encourage those of us who have owned them to give your horror stories or just recommendations, things you should do to get ahead of potential issues, things to fix certain issues which you might not be aware of, etc, etc. Using the comments section as kind of a resource, a guide, like a forum, if you will. So of course, check out the Dodge Ram reviews, the Range Rover SVR, etc. here on the channel if you're curious about those as well. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.